Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming for today's conference at PISM, entitled The Role of Think Tanks in Shaping US and EU Policy Towards Russia. It's my great pleasure to welcome distinguished panelists, especially Mrs. Karen Donfried, the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, with very impressive experience in both think tank and community, and as well as US administration, not to mention the position of Special Assistant to the President and Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council at the White House. So welcome at PISM. I would also like to welcome Mr. Marcin Zaborowski, the Vice President of the Center for European Policy Analysis, who has a large experience in the European think tank community, being quite recently the director of PISM, so welcome at home, and now the Vice President of CEPA, and previously he was a director of Transatlantic Program at the EU Institute for Strategic Studies. And last but not least, our good friend Christopher Hartwell, the president of Center for Social and Economic Research, CASE, a leading think tank on the post-Soviet area in terms of macroeconomic research and financial sector analysis and strategic planning. So our conference is a part of a global go-to think tank index led by the University of Pennsylvania. So it means that today, almost simultaneously in more than 40 places around the world, a new edition, 2015 edition of Go to Think Tank Index is launched. And it's important to remind you that we have some kind of advantage in terms of Americans or West Europeans in terms of time difference. So what we know now, it's really new. And this index, this report would be available on the website quite soon. But what I wanted to stress is that indeed the think tank community is a very large. Now we may say it's more than 8,000 think tanks in the world with different financing, structure, scope of interest. But what is common is just to provide the best expertise and to be as much useful as possible for decision makers. So this is definitely common, and this is what defines think tanks. And this index, particularly, I think this is the most important and the best known index at the world. It's important to underline that the index is composed by independent and quite large group of think tankers and public administration servants and their opinions, and it contains different rankings. So it means that the position of one particular think tank on the one list is not reflected on the other list. And so that's why everyone may find something interesting for us and the best position, I mean. So for us in Warsaw, it's very important the list of the best Eastern and Central European think tanks. And in previous years, usually we held the second or third position, PISM, just after CASE and Carnegie Moscow Center. And in this year, I'm very pleased to announce you that PISM is on the first position. So very sorry for CASE, but we are on the first. I'm very happy, and on this occasion, I would like to thank all people who are working here at PISM in the research office, public information library, PISM Academy, administration, publishing house for a very good work in this year. It was a very challenging year. Lots of elections we faced at PISM, and I'm very happy that we are in the first position. And also, this is some also gratitude to Marcin Zaborowski, who was a director of PISM quite recently. I mean, until the end of the half of previous year. Okay, so once again, thank you. And I also would like to congratulate GMF for a very high position among US think tanks, being also on the second place on the best think tank conference list. So this is a special ranking. In turn, CASE is also ranked on the 4th position in the top social policy think tanks, and holds the 11th place in the top domestic economic policy think tanks. So it's a very good record, while CEPA is quite high in terms of best advocacy campaign. So, as I mentioned before, the report would be released soon on PISM website and on the website Go to Think Tank. But now let me just come back to our main topic. I mean, the US, the role of think tanks in US and EU in terms of shaping policy towards Russia. So there's no doubt that Russia's foreign activity in recent years, I mean, its aggression in Ukraine and its military intervention in Syria, demolished Western hopes for a strong strategic partnership with Russia in the nearest future. And as a result, the US and EU have found themselves in need to rethink new long-term strategy towards Russia. And moreover, many Western countries discovered shortage of expertise on Russia within diplomatic and intelligence institutions. And they realized that the work of so-called Cold War warriors who know Russia and previously Soviet Union very well is still very essential for providing clear information and advice on political developments, economic perspectives, and current military programs in Russia. So that's why my first question goes to Ms. Karen Donfried. I would like to ask you how well equipped are think tanks in the US to analyze Russia, and in what extent current US government is open for this kind of expertise?
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be at PISM on this critical day where you've got the top ranking in the Go-To Think Tank survey. So I'll toast you with my glass of water. Cheers to PISM. So to your question about U.S. think tanks and their work on Russia, you know, it's interesting because I think what you saw happen in the United States is with the end of the Cold War, so really over the past 25 years, you saw that expertise diminish in the U.S. And you know, there used to be a whole cohort of experts at U.S. think tanks who focused on the Soviet Union and then were focusing on Russia. And over time, that really diminished that group of people. And I think that there was an assumption behind that proved to be false. But the assumption was that Russia had made a strategic decision that cooperating with the West was more in Russia's interest than engaging in open conflict. And that assumption prevailed until we saw Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. And then I think there was a realization in the U.S. that we really had lost a lot of capability in terms of think tank expertise on understanding Russia. You saw it within the U.S. government as well, but you saw it in the think tank community too. And that was a period of time when I was in government. And we did reach out to outside experts for input into the policymaking process, but it was really striking how small that number of outside experts was in that time frame of 2013, 2014. So I think, you know, you saw think tanks focus more on sort of rising challenges. So you saw think tanks investing more on expertise on China and these other countries rather than keeping that expertise on Russia. So that would be my opening comment on the U.S.
Maybe a similar question to Mr. Marcin Zaborowski. How difficult now for your institute is to provide expertise on Central Europe and Russia, or maybe in reverse, maybe it's a good opportunity that because of Russia's aggression, it's much easier to have access to decision makers and to provide expertise and also to attract them to this region.
Well, thank you, and let me start by congratulating PISM for taking this position. I have very little to do with that because, as you know, I have not directed PISM for over 8 months right now. So this is really mostly thanks to the work of the research office and a very good promotion and the publicity given to the research office organized by the Public Information Office. So the PISM itself deserves to be congratulated for the excellent work in that. And of course, case will be able to make up maybe next year, yeah. But you guys been there on the top for so many years, and you know, I think somebody of ranking organizer decided that you know, there was time for change, just to make it look a little bit different, yeah. And of course also congratulations to GMF. Everybody knows that Brussels Forum is a fantastic conference, a prime conference in Europe and the world. But GMF is not only conferencing, it's also excellent research and analysis. Since Karen took over, that line of work has only increased in GMF, and it's a real pleasure to read your work these days. Now, going to your question on Central Eastern Europe, Russia, and you know, the work of CEPA on these issues, in many respects, it's easier perhaps because the area gets a lot of traction now in Washington D.C. I remember when I traveled to DC about 6-7 years ago, when I was still working at the EU Institute for Security Studies, and I was responsible for transatlantic relations. And you know, being a Pole, I arrive in DC, I go around and I meet the various think tankers. And of course, as a Pole, one of the first questions would be, so what do we do about Russia? You know, what about Eastern Europe? And a lot of responses I would get is were of the sort, you know, nobody works on Russia anymore. You know, people who used to work on Russia are requalified and they work on China. There is not much to say about Russia these days, and so on. That was the case a few years ago. Now this argument has changed. You know, you no longer have to go to the meeting and justify yourself. Why is it that you are even interested in Russia? That means that there is more attention, more traction in the strategic community. The same thing about Congress, which frankly also means that there will be perhaps in the future more fundraising opportunity related to the area. Where you don't really need to justify why are you interested. And I see in the presidential campaign now in primaries, you know, Russia, Ukraine, NATO get more traction that it has done over the last, as long as I've been watching US elections, frankly. You know, crisis in our part of the world is bad for our part of the world, but it's not so bad for the strategic community and for think tanks.
Christopher, I mean, your work is a little bit different. I mean, you focus on expertise on macroeconomic issue, financial sector reforms, and indeed, in Russia, we may observe growing authoritarianism and some kind of, you know, assertiveness towards liberal thinking, toward free trade, etc. So, in this regard, how much Russia's policy influence your activity on the post-Soviet area in countries like, you know, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, which have a very good and important relations with Russia, and maybe now they are not so open for your expertise?
Right, I think that's a very good question. First, as the last one going, let me say how honored I am to share this stage with such august personalities, and obviously congratulations to PISM. To kind of come to your question, I mean, we've always been engaged with Russia. We've always been engaged with kind of the Central Eastern European region to transition space and kind of the Commonwealth of Independent States, Central Asia, although to a lesser extent. So our focus has always been on Russia, but we've gone through the same kind of cycle of why are you focusing more? We've actually, even as a think tank, to kind of relate both halves of this presentation, we've had to go and look at strategically where our focus should be, because transition is over, according to the European Union. So should we be focusing more on issues of European integration? Or should we kind of keep one foot in Europe and one foot in our background as a transition think tank? And it's been very difficult for us strategically to think that way. The events of the past 2 or 3 years have really kind of renewed not only Europe and the US's focus on Russia and kind of the CIS space, but it's also given us a little bit of invigoration because there's more work to be done now in the periphery of Russia. Russia itself is a black box, always has been to some extent during the Cold War. And that was the whole point of Kremlinology, was trying to discern what the Politburo was saying on any given day. But so Russia right now is fairly closed in terms of its policies. We comment regularly on where it's going in the wrong direction. I lived in Moscow for 2 years before moving to Warsaw, so I have kind of that inside knowledge and my contacts that I keep up with. We also like to comment when Russia is doing well. The Central Bank of Russia is in obviously a very difficult place economically, but I think it's one of the best institutions in Russia for handling what's happening. But that's just one tiny bright spot. So it may sound like we're anti-Russian, but we're just commenting on bad policy, of which there is no, there's no dearth of bad policy in Russia. But we have, while Russia is closed, we have really moved towards looking at Ukraine, looking at Moldova, and looking at Central Asia more than we did in the past, mainly because Kazakhstan is more of an opportunity now. Not only to kind of look at the difficulties it has because of Russian policies within this nascent Eurasian Economic Union, but also in ways that Poland's experience in transition can be applied. Not just only to Ukraine, who's in the headlines, not only to Moldova, who's now in the headlines for similar reasons, but also kind of further east. So there is an opportunity here for think tanks to kind of get involved. As I say, from CASE's point of view, we've always been involved, but now people are starting to look back in our direction, whether it's the US, whether it's the European Union. I don't know how long that will actually kind of keep, because I think we can all agree that these things are cyclical. I think already attention is starting to wane from Russia, especially in DC, as other things come up, Iran, China, whatever. So it's very difficult to keep the focus. But that's something that we as think tanks need to do, is kind of continue to bring this good, rigorous, methodologically accurate research to the public and say that, no, this is still a problem. Just because it's not on the front page today, it is still a problem.
Thank you. At the beginning, I mentioned that the Western countries, US, EU, we have a strong need to reformulate, to rethink our long-term strategy towards Russia. But I think that we may find some voices that not at all, that of course it was a big surprise what Vladimir Putin decided 2 years ago, and with Ukraine and quite recently with Syria. But there are some people who may say that we should come back to the business as usual approach. So my question to you, how you and your think tanks, how are you situated in this area? I mean, do you think that indeed we need a new strategy towards Russia as a Western countries? And if yes, so what kind of elements in this strategy you would like to recommend for decision makers in US and EU? Or rather you think that we should wait a little bit and maybe, this situation would de-escalate, and maybe Russia itself will come back to this cooperation or approach, and then we'll continue our policy from previous years. So Karen, I would like to be first.
So the short answer would be plan for the worst and hope for the best. But I think you do need to put in place a longer-term strategy with regard to Russia. And I think that actually is the sweet spot for think tanks. I think what's hard for think tanks is crisis management. That's what governments do. And, that's what you saw was needed in the immediate aftermath of the illegal annexation of Crimea and continuing Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine, which of course is still going on. But I think we're now through that initial crisis management, and it's appropriate for people to be thinking about what is the longer term strategy toward Russia that we should be putting into place. And if you look at it through the prism of GMF, we do not have a tradition actually of having much Russia expertise at GMF. We have lots of folks who are expert on Eastern Europe and on Russia's neighborhood, those countries that are not members of the EU and NATO, but border Russia. We have 2 trust funds, one of which focuses on the Black Sea region and is trying to support civil society there. But what we did 2 years ago now is we have something called the Transatlantic Academy based at GMF. And that brings a group of scholars from Europe and the US together for 1 academic year to look at a particular topic. And when the partners of the Transatlantic Academy sat down 2 years ago and we're trying to think about the topic for this year, a couple of us made a strong case for a focus on Russia. And one of the partners said, oh, but gosh, that's going to be solved by the academic year 2015-2016. And I was one of the people who said, I don't think so. I think this is a longer-term challenge. And so at the moment, we have this cohort of Russia experts with us in DC, and it's terrific because I think we are now at that moment where everyone is stepping back saying, well, what is the longer-term strategy we in the United States, we in Europe should be putting into place with regard to Russia? And these scholars are going to be putting out a proposed strategy document in April or May. And I think there are going to be various elements to that. I'm curious to see where they end up, but I think one of the big questions that we in the United States have grappled with is, can we have essentially a compartmentalized relationship with Russia, where you say on an issue like Ukraine, there's a fundamental disagreement. And there are various elements to that relationship with Russia. One is making clear that what Russia did is wrong and that there are sanctions that go along with that. And I would applaud, actually, the transatlantic unity we've seen in putting in place sanctions. But there's always been another element to that policy as well, which is we need to keep talking to the Russians, because the hope is that that pressure we're applying on Russia will encourage President Putin to seek a diplomatic off-ramp. That has not been true to date, but that is the hope. And, you know, you have that policy on Ukraine being pursued. On the other hand, we've seen cooperation with Russia on an issue such as Iran, the P5+1 agreement. Syria is, I think, a lot more complicated. It's not at all obvious to me that Russia's cooperating with the U.S. in terms of targeting ISIS. But you've seen this differentiated policy. Do we see that continuing or not? So I think there's lots of grist for that mill of putting down on paper what is the longer-term strategy. And I think that's a place where think tanks can be very helpful precisely because we are not in the day-to-day policymaking process. And we can step back and use our expertise and institutional knowledge of this relationship to try to put into place a more thoughtful longer-term strategy.
If I'm correct, Karen is trying to say that in some extent frenemy concept should be adopted to Russia. I mean that in some regard Russia should be regarded as an enemy and in Iran deal rather as a friend or a partner. And my question is going to Marcin. I mean, do you have the same approach in your institute? Do you think that indeed we should be more flexible and adopt this concept and analyze different small strategies towards Russia rather than a big strategy that Russia is regarding as an enemy and we should deter this country? So please.
Not so much. Well, as you pointed out, you know, CEPA did well in the category of advocacy group, even though we don't really position ourselves as advocacy group. And I think the reason for that is that CEPA has always advocated a policy towards Russia that should be predominantly value-based and principled. If Russia continues with its violation of international law, if it continues to play games with Syria, interfering in affairs of states in Central Eastern Europe, playing games with energy, as long as this is the case, and I don't think it will stop being the case in maybe our lifetime, CEPA will be always urging caution with regard to any kind of reapproachment with Russia. and that's a position which we consistently take. That's why we focus now on issues like deliverables of the incoming NATO summit, calling for a stronger US engagement in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as on basically addressing the discrepancy that exists there between those states from Central Eastern Europe that joined NATO in at the end of the last century and the rest of NATO. We are all aware that the level of the of a possible implementation of Article 5 in this part of Europe is far more inferior than what you have in Western Europe. Yeah? And CEPA for a long time has been saying that this gap needs to be addressed. So we would not be calling for a reapproachment with Russia for the sake of, for example, finding an agreement in Syria or Iran or some other place. We focus on Central and Eastern Europe, and we focus on promoting certain set of values.
Christopher, a few years ago, the President Putin introduced a new law, so-called foreign agents, for NGOs who are in Russia and who use foreign monies, and they are automatically enlisted as a foreign agents, and it provokes many problems for this institution. So, in this regard, how do you operate in Russia, and you try to provide, clear economic expertise without any political context, and what kind of elements you stress, in this effort to attract attention of decision makers on the local and central level in Russia?
Impossible. It's absolutely impossible to kind of give economic advice without a political context in Russia. The foreign agent law it's hit us personally because we were a member of certain networks based in Russia, kind of friends of Russian economists or things like that we had to withdraw from. We couldn't even participate as observer status because we would have to pay, and that automatic transfer of money thus opened up the network to all sorts of legal thorny issues. So it's been very, very difficult for us to kind of continue the formal links that we've had. We do a lot of work with the Gaidar Institute. Personally, I've been to the Gaidar Forum several times. I'm also a visiting professor at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy in Moscow. So that's kind of a way that we get in, if we can kind of sell it as purely academic, because academics in Russia have the same kind of incentives as academics anywhere else. They need to publish, they need to kind of increase their visibility and things like that. But we have to kind of choose topics that are fairly anodyne, that are fairly very technical in terms of economics or economic modeling, so that we're not really kind of wandering into this politically charged minefield. Other than that, really, it's been very difficult. We've been going through the Russian press. We've had some things published, or we've been seeking funding from international institutions that Russia hasn't been kicked out of yet, or that Russia hasn't voluntarily withdrawn from, such as the World Bank. And in that case, it's a lot of kind of looking for Russian partners. The problem is, that the atmosphere in Russia is just very, very difficult right now. The word liberal, in kind of the Burkean European sense, is a dirty word. Dealing with people like the Gaidar Institute also says a lot about who we are, and then automatically attracts suspicion. We had, I'm proud to say, we had our first hit piece from Russian trolls about a year ago now, I think. Because one of the people on our supervisory council is Vladimir Mao. He's well connected with Putin. He's a respected academic. He's also the rector of the university that I'm a visiting professor at. So he's on our supervisory council. There was a journalist based in Moscow who was actually outed as a KGB spy in the US in the 1980s, who wrote a 17, 18-page hit piece on case and about how we are doing the bidding of Washington and Brussels and pushing the agenda, and here's all of the shadowy links we have with people in Russia, and we asked Vladimir Mao if he knew anything about this organization, and he didn't, and so forth. So that to me is, a badge of honor, because I think the character of an organization can be measured by the quality of its enemies. And if we're creating waves out there that people possibly on the Kremlin payroll have to go out and write these 17, 18-page screeds against us, well, then we must be doing something right. But on the other hand, it attracts a lot of unwanted attention and makes it very difficult to give the kind of advice that we do. We're out there in the media, we're publishing in Poland, we're publishing internationally, we're saying what good policy is, what bad policy is, but it's very difficult to kind of separate that out from the political side. As I say, in all contexts, we focus on policies and not personalities. It's not our fault that some personalities have a one-to-one correspondence with bad policy.
Thank you. Before giving a floor to audience and just to allowing for your question to panelists, I would like to ask you for last thing what you, Christopher, mentioned about this the Russian partners. As we know, there is so-called Russian liberals. I mean, people like Alexei Kudrin, the former Minister of Finance, Vladimir Mao, and many others. And indeed, we may say that in Russia now it's rather hawkish people who are in the power. However, quite recently, some signals were pushed by Kremlin. For example, to Munich conference, there will be Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, not Mr. Lavrov, be there. Or, for example, partners in terms of Ukraine crisis. It's not only MFA officials, but Władysław Surkov or Boris Gryzlov. So do you think that there is possible in Russia to find people who would be much more, let's say, liberal and with whom we should cooperate, and how you cooperate with this kind of people in Russia, taking into account this very difficult situation in terms of, atmosphere of war and growing authoritarianism? Or you think that it's a waste of time? There's no point to, let's say, invest in so-called Russian liberals, because Russia now is a country, led by one man, and there is no point to waste time for such kind of investment. So, your attitude towards Russian liberals? Yes, please.
Yeah. Sorry, I want to jump in on this one, because this has been the issue, I think, with the overall strategy that the West, both the US, the EU, has had toward Russia, has been problematic, is that, we talk about, you named names, you named personalities, and this has been the problem, is that we've associated liberals in Russia with specific people. I mean, this was the problem with the US policy, is that we supported Yeltsin for so long. I'm an American, in case you couldn't tell from my accent. The US supported Yeltsin for so long as the bastion of Russian democracy without really cultivating the institutions and the ideology behind it. We shouldn't be supporting liberals. We should be supporting liberal thought. And I think that's one of the problems that we've seen in the past couple of years, why Putin is so incredibly popular, maybe not 99.9% popular, but is that there isn't a credible alternative. And this is the exact same problem we saw in Ukraine, is that there wasn't a credible alternative from the opposition. We had the Orange Revolution, they got in power, they bickered amongst each other for 6 or 7 years, and Yanukovych came back. I think this is the exact same problem in Russia, and I think this is something that our think tanks should be really focusing on, is fostering the ideas that a market economy is good. It's not just about a few well-connected people ripping off the rest of, ripping off state assets and surviving at the behest of everyone else. It's not, democracy isn't voting in the least crooked politician. We need to continue to hammer these ideas. We need to win the war of ideas, which we're not doing right now. And I think we're still coming back to focusing on specific people. Who can we identify as allies? I mean, obviously we have to do this, but we don't have to do this, actually. Policymakers have to do this. We don't have to. We have to find common cause with like-minded people, no matter where they are, in terms of the hierarchy. And I think that's how we need to continue to approach working in Russia, pushing our ideas in Russia, and helping Russia to move forward.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. I mean, I think it's important to see that even the so-called more liberal outlets in Russia and individuals who have a license to talk to us and to express some measure of dissent with Kremlin are exactly what I said. They are licensed to do that. They are part of a game which is arranged by Kremlin in many respects. Sometimes they do some opening, we get into that, we start writing these papers about, you know, how we can open up and have new reapproachment, reset, and so on. And then Kremlin is pulling certain levers to that fits with the game. So I think it's important to support liberal thought, but be very careful about you know, licensed individuals and institutions, and be aware that they might be elements in the game played by Putin.
You know, I also just think that the point that Christopher brought up about Russian trolls and the extent to which they are keeping track of everything that's being said makes it a very difficult environment, not only for those in Russia who are pursuing liberal thought, but for those across Europe and in the US. I mean, it's really striking to me, my colleagues who write on these topics, I mean, immediately there are blog posts and these voices that come challenging what they're saying, and it can be very unpleasant for people living outside of Russia as well who come under this pressure. And I think that, you know, maybe to pick up a point Marcin made earlier, I think for those of us who are active in think tanks in Europe and in the United States, having our analysis come from a place of principles and values is really important, because that's fundamentally, I think, what unites us in our analysis of Russia and putting together that new strategy. So I think that foundation is really critical.
Thank you. And now I think we have maybe maximum half an hour, so just time for questions from the audience. So if you have some question, please raise your hand and say affiliation. You have a microphone? Okay. So maybe I will collect a few ones. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Good morning to everybody. I'm the ambassador of Portugal, and I have a question for Marcin, if I may. And if I could ask you to elaborate a little bit more on your statement regarding the gap on the implementation of Article 5 between different members of NATO, if I can put it like that. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe this.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for a good question and for being quite regular appearance here in this room. It's good to have ambassadors always engaged with the strategic community. I think the gap is pretty obvious, frankly. It's at the height of the Cold War. We had how many troops in Western Europe? Something like 330,000, if I'm not mistaken.
It was up to 400,000 at one point, U.S. troops.
Most of which was being based in Germany, Denmark, Italy, frontline areas. Now we are frontline areas. And there is what, like 300-400 troops. Well, perhaps if you add Romania to that, it can, you know, go up to about 1,000. Yeah? So the gap is obvious. Now, until a few years ago, there was no contingency planning. You know, thanks to, in fact, Obama administration, surprisingly, we do have elements of contingency planning now. But you know, until about like 8-9 years ago, perhaps Karen knows more about it from her experience in the White House, that really wasn't the case. You know, it's quite obvious that if push comes to shove, the defense of, for example, the Baltic states would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, under the, you know, logistical capabilities we have on the ground, and you know, and frankly, you know, troops which are located in northeastern Europe. The gap is huge. And in many respects is the consequence of the NATO-Russia Funding Act, whereby we limited ourselves, well, NATO limited itself to maintain certain constraints on itself with regard to its presence in Central and Eastern Europe. And NATO, until now, stands to very rigorous understanding of these provisions. Russia does not abide to any of these provisions, but for some reason we do. So that's my answer, Ambassador.
Okay, so here, question.
I would like to go to the main theme of our meeting. I'm a journalist. I had a feeling that nowadays the think tanks, even the most prestigious, really have a very small influence of the real politics towards Russia in a general terms, and it is the same in a European Union. When you look, when you ask what is the European Union stand towards Russia, nobody can answer. Some would say it's enemy. Some would say, oh no, it's a partner. Look at Afghanistan, look at Hungary, look at some other countries. So what I am trying to say, I would like to ask a brutal question. Do you believe, working in a prestigious think tanks, that you have real any influence of shaping American and European Union policy, general policy towards Russia? If you have not, please do answer.
Okay, thank you very much. So this question about your know-how, how with your channels, how you influence decision makers.
Brutal questions deserve brutal answers, and I would say, as a more European think tank, no, we don't have a lot of influence. But we don't have a lot of kind of the broad-based influence in that a report that CASE puts out or that a presentation or a conference we have isn't going to send people running from the room, calling Brussels, and then there's going to be a sea change. I think one of the things that we do that is very interesting is that, I mean, Washington, D.C. is the same ways, but Brussels is it's a company town. It's very closed. It's got people from all over Europe. But it is very kind of insular in terms of its thinking. We call it the inside the beltway thinking in the United States. So that simply providing an alternate voice is very, very important to kind of break people out of their normal paradigm, their normal way of thinking. I spoke at Bruegel a couple of months ago, and part of it was on Ukraine. And I said, about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the illegal annexation of Crimea, continued Russian aggression, using these words, brutally honest words. And afterwards, I had people come up to me and say, thank you for saying that, because we never hear that here. We don't hear Russian invasion of Ukraine. We don't hear aggression. These are not diplomatic terms. So being out there and saying, what we experience as a think tank that works in Ukraine, that has Ukrainians on our staff, that has a visiting fellow right now who is interviewing Ukrainian refugees and economic migrants to find out why they're in Poland and why they're not in Donetsk. It's something that we don't have the influence that we'd want, but we're not policymakers. So we can't. We'd go out, we get elected, and then we could change the policies. Our idea right now is to kind of have this slow drip of influence, because it's what we are, and I think we're honest with ourselves about that. I mean, we have influence where we can. We have had influence. We don't have the huge scale, but I think that's just impossible for us as a Central European think tank.
I largely agree with that. I would add up, a couple of points. I would say that indeed, I mean, if you look for some kind of direct influence, meaning that a think tank writes a paper and then the government does what the think tank writes, then you wouldn't find many examples of that happening in the world. However, if you think long term, I think there are not small elements of examples which prove that that the think tank and also academic thought has been very influential on shaping the long-term strategies. For example, and that's an ambivalent example in many respects, but the decision to go to war in Iraq following the terrorist attack of the United States was in not to a small extent influenced by think tank community, especially on the conservative side. And I mean here the American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, and so on. And they've been calling for that for a long time before that. So, and they had a very precise elements being put in place on how it should unravel itself. And we may see the war in Iraq in, not everyone is a great fan of that, and think tanks don't always influence, administration in a good way. They can also influence administration in the way which then proves counterproductive. But on the other hand, I also think that think tanks sometimes they have this role of a ethical break on some attempts of the administration to go to business with some bad fellows to go back to business as usual. I think if think tanks were not raising all the time constantly the rationale for maintaining sanctions with Russia, and then if this opinion were not being picked up by mass media, press, electronic media, and so on, then I think there will be quite few governments in Europe who would be very tempted to very openly, argue against maintenance of sanctions. So I think that the role of think tanks is not direct, but I think that we do contribute to shape certain opinion on this issue. Or, for example, to maintaining certain standards in relationship with China. I think the paper of European Council on Foreign Affairs was quite influential here in Europe, in actually stopping the Europeans from rushing into the Chinese embrace without any consideration for human rights records and so on. And ECFR has this method of grading the countries, and if you find yourself on the list and it says that you've been a slacker, for example, or you've been unethical, and then it goes all over, mass media, that puts a certain, that gives politicians a pause. And there is also a very vital element in the United States with regard to think tanks. The think tankers like Karen were formerly working in the administration. And I'm hoping that, they will come, Karen will again work in the administration. It will be lost for GMF, but, but these people do it all the time. The ambassadors, the people who run foreign policy are people who were formerly think tankers and are people who those who are in administration now will become think tankers. So the experience they gather with the administration when used in the think tank world, the experience they get in the, in being exposed to unorthodox thinking, then leads into the administration and eventually pays in US, foreign policy being perhaps a little bit more innovative and being, more unorthodox. And that we don't have it to the same extent, unfortunately, in Europe.
Yeah, that's a great lead into what I was going to say, because I do think the think tank environment in the U.S. is still quite different from in Europe. And there are various reasons for that, but I think one of them actually has to do with our system of government. That in Europe, you have parliamentary systems of government. So, the executive branch is always going to have a majority in your parliament that supports it. Whereas in the U.S., we traditionally have divided government. So Barack Obama may be the Democratic president of the United States, but that doesn't mean he has two houses of the U.S. Congress that are supporting his policy. So it initially started that Congress was looking for other sources of information because they didn't want to rely on the executive branch because they didn't necessarily share those views. So I think a different political system in the U.S. is part of what explains that more think tank community, but it's also the point Marcin made, which is in the US, you have much more fluid career paths. So you have people moving between government and think tanks in a way that you just don't have that in Europe to date. And so it means that people, when they are not in government, may be based at a think tank, actually building intellectual capital that they will take back into government with them. And you see this on both sides of the political aisle. And it's interesting because you can point, I mean, you know, the Iraq War was mentioned, but I also think of a former colleague of mine, Ron Asmus, who with others at RAND did a lot of intellectual work on NATO enlargement that influenced government policy, not just in Europe, actually, critically importantly in Germany as well. And then he later became part of a Clinton administration that put in place those policies. So it's always hard to quantify influence or sometimes see it, but there actually are some very stark examples where you can see how that work in think tanks in very real ways influence government policy. And that sort of leads to my third point, which is maybe we shouldn't just think of these organizations as think tanks. I mean, in the U.S. we have this term that they're also do tanks, that you also want to not just be thinking, but actually implementing policy. And, you know, GMF has a range of activities. One of those activities is thinking, producing policy papers. We also have a long-standing fellowship program where we're, you know, taking next generation into, you know, bringing young Europeans to the U.S., sending young Americans to Europe to create a sensibility about the transatlantic relationship, which is our particular policy focus. And then these civil society trust funds I mentioned, where, you know, we actually have grantees on the ground in Ukraine. And it's so interesting to think about how do you infuse that perspective into the policy work that we do. And those are things that are incredibly valuable to governments. So, you know, a fourth area in which we can influence government is simply by briefing government officials. And this is true across all of our offices. So we have the headquarters in Washington, we have 7 offices across Europe, but every one of those offices on a regular basis is being invited into ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of defense, national security councils to share our thinking and perspectives. Now, you don't know exactly how that fits into policy formulation, but there's no better way than to be able to brief that policy paper in person to those policymakers. And then just a final point is I think tanks can also provide a platform for conversations that are not happening at government level. And, you know, before when we were talking about maybe with the end of the Cold War, as some of the focus in think tanks shifted from Russia to China, interestingly, in the transatlantic relationship, we don't actually have a good mechanism in government for talking about issues like China. And GMF, about 7 years ago, started a forum that brings together Americans and Europeans, and on the second day involves Chinese as well, to have that conversation. And I think it's critically important that we figure out how to do that at government level as well. But I think we as think tanks can make a contribution by creating a platform for policymakers to engage in that conversation with experts. And you can, you know, in that relationship, take a very concrete example like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where American and European policymakers arrived at a different conclusion. I mean, Europeans decided to join the bank, Americans did not. Fair enough. We're going to disagree about right policies to pursue, but that we did not coordinate our policies, so that rather than the headline in the newspaper being Americans and Europeans divide over AIIB, that's where I scold us as a policy community, that we should have managed that and presented those policy differences in a different way. And I think we're going to have another opportunity this year in terms of market economy status for China to see how the transatlantic community manages an issue where we may come to different policy conclusions. So I think those are all areas where think tanks actually do play a role in the policy process that I think is valuable.
So think tanks are more flexible than public administration, can be very influential, but what's with their credibility? I mean, there are a very famous phrase that think tanks, it's a bridge between academia and politics, between media and politics. But what does it mean exactly? How do you improve your standards, credentials, just, not to be too much affiliated to some political camps, but just to attract, attention of different audience, of a big audience. So about credibility, if I may, and then the last round of questions.
Well, obviously, different think tanks have different credibility. There is this place, this outlet in Paris, which is called something like Institute of Global Studies, and is basically a place, funded by Putin money to promote, Putin propaganda with perfect British accents. So, of course, you can have think tanks that are basically being used or are even created for the very purposes of become a mouthpiece of a government or some bad guys. Yes, think tanks have had in the recent years there have been some questions about the fundraising structure, about who think tanks accept money from, and so on. There have been certain articles in the New York Times on that, about think tanks in the US, accepting money from foreign governments, and then in exchange offering some services. As of now, the only proven case of that was accepting money from Norway. That is not exactly the human right breaker, if you like. Yeah? But it is very important that think tanks have strict code of conducts, and that they have, such as PISM has, for example, very strict rules on accepting donations, and it is important that think tanks talk to each other about it too, so that there is a transparency when it's possible, and that the rules are being clear on these issues. But you would always find think tanks which are especially in non-democracies, which are being used basically to in China, in Russia, and so on, which are being used to promote government's agenda.
I think this issue of credibility of think tanks is incredibly important, and in the U.S., we have some think tanks that are very clearly and openly aligned with a certain political perspective. And then we have think tanks that very much aim to be nonpartisan in the work that they do. And, I think there are various elements to the credibility of a think tank. The point that Marcin raised about funding is a critical one, and it's something that in the U.S. there's been a lot of attention to over the past year in particular. I mean, Marcin referenced an article that had appeared in the New York Times. It was actually a front page article about foreign funding of think tanks, and interestingly, the focus was Norway, because Norway is so transparent about where its money goes. But I think the author had a very difficult time showing anything nefarious about Norwegian influence through this funding. And it was interesting because that journalist actually called me at GMF and asked about foreign funding. And I said, I run an organization that is called the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Yes, we receive foreign funding. We would not exist were it not for an initial, very generous gift of the West German government of Willy Brandt. And for those of you who aren't familiar with GMF's history, basically on the 25th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, the then West German government wanted to say thank you to us Americans for the Marshall Plan. And the idea that they settled on was creating an organization that would be dedicated to transatlantic cooperation. So that explains our complicated name. So it was German funding to create an American institute. And so what I said to this reporter is, we have funding from other European governments as well, and that's a badge of honor for us. We are openly dedicated to strengthening the transatlantic relationship. So, we're clear about that. That's what we do. But I would challenge you to point to how funding from European governments influences GMF policy lines. So to say that because we get funding from X government, we support X policy, I don't think you're going to be able to draw that line, because there is a diversity of opinion within GMF. And if you look at the events that we do, we're not just inviting people who all say the same thing. We actually want to have disagreement in our panel discussions. We always want there to be a challenger. So when we invite those members of the U.S. Congress who co-chair the TTIP caucus, for example, well, we have another event that has the head of the AFL-CIO and the head of the German counterpart union that are raising very critical questions about trade agreements. So what we're trying to do is have a debate about the most relevant policy issues. And I think that's what gives you credibility in a think tank community. But I think we have to be mindful that not all think tanks are looking for that. The ones Marcin gave as examples, or those who are very clearly aligned with a particular political point of view.
Sum this up quickly. I agree with both of these points, but I don't think if you have a particular viewpoint, it doesn't mean you necessarily have a lack of credibility. I think it really comes down to the research outputs. I mean, you could be more politically aligned because of, kind of the mission of the think tank. For instance, Case would never publish a report that says that renationalization of pension funds is something good, because we have all of this data and we have international experience saying that this is a bad idea. I think it's okay to have a viewpoint, but I think it comes back, the credibility comes that you can back it up. You're not just mouthing what other people are saying. You're not blindly going along with policies of your favorite political party, but that you've done the work, you have the data, you have the analysis, you can back up what you say, and you are in kind of the mainstream of academic thought as well as of policy thought. And then finally, about the transparency, that is huge. And I think that's the diversity of opinion within a think tank is really the strength of the think tank as well. But when funding comes in, you have to be upfront, you have to disclose. And what we say to, especially to our corporate donors, is that, first off, we're going to let people know that we accepted funding from a tobacco company, a pharmaceutical firm, or something like this, but it's in no way going to influence what our results are. If we end up with something that says counter to what you thought, well, then maybe it's your prerogative that you own it, you paid for it, but you don't publicize it, or it doesn't get publicized, but here's the data, here's the analysis. So the transparency, I think, is the hugest part of credibility, and I think that's something you don't see, and you'll get evasive answers, or it'll be difficult to find out who the funders are of think tanks that aren't very credible.
Okay, thank you. And the second round of questions, so I see one question.
Stanisław Skryru, Polish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to thank GMF for excellent program which you mentioned, Marshall Memorial Fellowship, of which I benefited in 2011. It's extremely important program which makes Europeans to understand much better America and bring the new generation of Americans who are a bit detached from European history to understand the much better Europe. Excellent program, and I'm very much hoping that you will continue. I always involved in the process after fellows are selected, in briefing them about their trip to America, what to expect and how to get ready for amazing ride across America. And then obviously we keep the alumni activities alive. And I was invited for 1st February to join alumni here in Warsaw. But my question is about Russia. It's obvious that there is no clear strategy towards Russia would be possible without setting a clear goal, what West wants to achieve in case of Russia. In the early 90s in the United States and in case of Europe, it lasted for 2 decades. There were goals and hopes to transform Russia, to model it according to liberal democracy and market economy matrix. Well, Russia, from 2004 at least, was sending signals to the West that it's not what they want. They, at least ruling elites, rejected the liberal democracy and market economy concept. And moreover, we discovered that they are trying to change our society. They are trying to project corruption into our economic system. So they are invading Ukraine in order to transform the European border, which we created. So they are trying to challenge us. My question is, what should be Western goal in the coming decade in relation with Russia? What we want to achieve? Thank you.
I don't think we could have a broader question, so it's very difficult to say what our goal should be. I think this is kind of the issue too. Is right now we're on the defensive. We in the West, even though the West isn't monolithic, we're on the defensive in how we position ourselves vis-a-vis Russia. Thinking, and I think that's a good way to say, kind of what should our goal be? I think our goal is still the same as in the early 1990s. It is to foster a liberal democracy. It is to foster a market economy in Russia. I mean, you say that the elites have kind of rejected it since 2004. You could even say earlier than that, again, with kind of the election of Yeltsin in 1996, already we kind of saw Russia going the other way, at least in terms of its political institutions, not necessarily its economic institutions. I think the goals remain the same. It's just a matter of the modalities of how we reach it now. The next few years, or as Marcin said, maybe even our lifetime, are going to be very difficult. But the Soviet Union lasted for 70 years, and then it collapsed, and we have success stories that were aided by people in the West that continued to kind of push these ideas. As I said before, it's not personalities, it's ideology, it's the war of ideas, and we have to continue waging that war. I'd say our long-term goal is exactly as it was in 1992, to have Russia being a productive and responsible member of the international community, to abide by its international agreements, to respect sovereignty, and everything that we kind of think of when we think of the community of nations. The way we do that from here on out, I think, is the most difficult part, and I think we can continue to quibble about what these specific mechanisms are, whether it's sanctions or economic pressure or opening the oil spigots and watching the Russian budget balance collapse. So the goals, I don't think, have changed, and I think where we come in is to really kind of argue about what the different mechanisms should be to get there, and also, as we mentioned at the beginning, to kind of keep the focus of policymakers on how we can reach those goals.
No, really much need to add, a great deal to that. I would just say that Russia is, well, as somebody who's representing CEPA, I have created conscience here, because CEPA has always been arguing that the tactical, the opening to Russia for some tactical gains, such as the START treaty, finding an agreement on Iran, and forgetting bigger goals in the process, was premature. That our policy towards Russia must remain principled. Otherwise, the message goes to Russia that we are weak-willed and that we could be bought by political concessions, or even sometimes directly, as Gerhard Schroeder has proven. I think that long-term, I agree with Brzezinski that long-term, Russian strategic interests will push it towards closer relationship with the West. Because Russia at the moment experiences this infatuation in relationship with China. That relationship is inherently unequal and means that sooner or later Russia will become Chinese vassal. And this is not what the Russians really want to put up with, longer term. So at the moment, the Chinese population is, infatuated by the propaganda streaming from Kremlin, anti-Western propaganda, and is frankly not thinking straight. But maybe in another life, I can imagine that this relationship will be based on a true cooperation.
Communication with Russians, that we really would like from Russia to be liberal and democratic in long-term perspective. But this is exactly what not only the Putin and political elite, but also society doesn't want. I mean, how many people in Russia, in terms of polls, want democracy and liberal market economy? Or just recently, security strategy of Russia released in January, when NATO and Western countries are indicated in the very first place as a threat for Russia. So don't you think that sometimes with Russians we have some hopes, which definitely are very good for us, but they are completely, not acceptable by Russians?
I mean, that just shows the limit of we have limit of influence on policy in our own countries. How can we kind of influence Russian public opinion if we're not on the ground there? We're not a Russian think tank. I mean, that's difficult. I think also this kind of comes back to another point, that we have to be sure in our ideas and be better defenders of what our long-term goals are. I think maybe as think tanks or as policymakers, we haven't had enough of the communication to be able to defend rule of law, to defend things that we take for granted as the minimum basis of Western society, to kind of filter through to Russia. But I mean, in terms of our influence, it's always going to be limited. We have hopes, we have dreams, we have desires, but there's only so much we can do. I think one of the reasons that it worked in Central and Eastern Europe, at the kind of collapse of the Cold War, was because there was a tangible alternative that was presented. I don't think Russia still has seen what the tangible alternative is. It was communism or kind of a state socialism, crony capitalism. I don't think they've actually seen, what the tangible alternative is yet.
And I would really question how deep our understanding of Russian public opinion is. I don't think there are any good measures out there. I wouldn't trust any of the polls that we see. So, I mean, I would just put that on the table. But it's certainly clear that Vladimir Putin, I think, is quite concerned about the opinions of his own people. And why was Ukraine such a challenge to him? Because, if Ukraine were to sign the association agreement with the EU, for Putin, that meant Ukraine leaving a Russian orbit and joining an orbit that he saw challenging his own rule. And the reaction after the uprising in the Maidan as well, I think, reinforced how concerned Putin was about colored revolutions potentially in Russia as well. So certainly it's for the Russian people to decide what they want their future to be. But I think the message that we so clearly have tried to back in terms of our American, European response to what happened in Ukraine is that we in the West support the principle that it is for citizens to determine their own futures. And it's not acceptable for a larger, stronger country to take over the sovereign territory of its weaker neighbor. And these principles that we are upholding in the case of Ukraine, I think, point to some of the maybe modalities that Christopher was referring to, that long-term goal. I mean, we think that it's in Russia's interest that it become a democracy and pursue liberal economic policies. We see that as good for Russia. It's up to Russia to make that decision. But in the interim, I think what we're doing is showing, the importance of transatlantic solidarity in how we meet that challenge. And just maybe to pick up the MMF point, one of the things I'm always so struck by with our Marshall Memorial Fellows is it's not only actually about Europeans understanding the U.S. and vice versa, but the Europeans travel through the U.S. in mixed groups. So, you know, you'll have a French, a Serb, a Pole, a German. And I've had lots of the European MMFs say, you know, I, as a French, had never met a Serb before. So it's interesting in that it also enhances sort of European sensibilities. And one of the challenges in reacting to Ukraine, let's be honest, I mean, Putin was banking on the fact that Europe would not be united in its response and that we wouldn't be united across the Atlantic. And I think there's been a power in Americans and Europeans together standing up and saying, we don't feel this is acceptable, and there are principles and values that we are going to defend. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is, I think, one of the most critical things we can do as Americans and Europeans is help Ukraine succeed. What more powerful model is there for Russians to see than a Ukraine that's successful? And, you know, I'm so struck by it being here in Warsaw. If we look back 25 years, Ukraine and Poland didn't look that different in terms of economic performance. They look very different today. So we, you know, we're not just buffeted by winds here. We have our own agency on these issues, and we should use it to help Ukrainians achieve a more positive outcome for their own citizens.
Okay, so unfortunately our time is running out, so I think that today we had a great opportunity to learn more about think tanks, their influences, their credentials, and we had different let's say perspectives from Europe, from US. So I really like to thank panelists, audience for coming for this discussion, and please visit our website and find the Go to Think Tank Index report in upcoming time. Okay, so thank you once again, and please, John, thank you, panelists.